Good morning, Ms. Boledi Tladi. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. You look beautiful this morning. How's your morning been so far?
Thanks. It's been slow, steady, but good.
Mm-hmm.
You look quite good
Uh,
yourself. How are you
good,
going?
good is great. I mean, having a good morning is, I think the rest of your day is set up for greatness if your morning is good, isn't it?
Right, set up for success all the way.
Have you had your coffee yet?
I am now caffeine free since the pandemic started.
Or why? By choice or
By
why? Why?
choice. I used
Are
to
you
be
serious?
I used to be like a heavy coffee drinker, and then
Mm.
the pandemic came, and I was getting enough rest and enough sleep, and there was just no
Hmm.
need for coffee
Wow.
anymore.
Salute to you. I'm having my coffee now. I don't feel guilty. Sorry.
Not at all good. I would have also never felt guilty. It was just like that time, for change.
Lovely. So
Yeah.
we're just gonna go straight into the topic, and I'm gonna introduce you to, the listeners, as well as give them a brief outline about what Basadi Mental Health Associates is about. And you've advised us and told us that Basadi Mental Health Associates is a group of Black female psychologists that are doing very, very well. You guys are doing amazing, and
Thank
we've
you.
also learned that the pillars that you guys possess and your core values include being accessible, being a representative, as well as upholding community mental health. You guys are also available via email at info@ribasadi mha.com, as well as the website www.ribasadimha.com. I want to salute you for the work that you're doing for our community, and we're really privileged to have you this morning. So thank you for your time
Thank
and
you.
joining
Thank
us
you.
this morning. So just to give the theme of this season with our collaboration with Ribasadi Mental Health Associates, we will be getting down to the root. We'll be getting down to the root and understanding Black mental health. And the topic for this conversation is the history of Black mental health. So, in a nutshell, we just want to explore mental health as it was understood in the pre-colonial times of Africa, and what it means in terms of where it comes from, and in collaboration with the Western practices that we've adopted in terms of psychology. So what is mental health according to the pre-colonial times within Africa? So without further ado, we'll be handing over to our wonderful presenter or representative, or rather director of Basadi Mental Health Associates, and we'll just hear what she has to say about this important topic. So, Ms. Boledi,
Thank
over to
you.
you.
Thanks. I guess the place to start, right, when we're thinking of what we thought of or what we understood of healing and health practices in Africa, before capitalist times and things like that, was for us, healing was always a primarily spiritual practice, right? There was no way to kind of separate the healing
Yeah.
practice from, you know, um, from from the spiritual aspect of us as human beings. So I want to kind of start there, saying that that's something that
Mm,
where Black people are concerned as well, specifically, there's no way to really separate spirituality from any part of our lives, right? In any way that we move, in any way
mm,
that we think, in any way, even when we fall ill, right? Usually, what's the first thing people say? Like,
yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, that speaks of,
Hey, because
yeah,
we're black.
yeah. Especially if it's intense, we're like, no, somebody
Yes.
bewitched me,
Yeah.
or sisters are angry with me, or a spiritual cleansing is needed. There's always that element of
Mm,
realizing that it's not just physical, it's not just mental, it's not just emotional,
mm,
but all of this is somehow spiritually
mm.
affected. And you see that with the kinds of
Sure.
illness we have, I suppose now we recognize them as traditional healers, but I suppose in pre-colonial times they were just healers of the time. They were the doctors of the time, right? And what were they? They were also spiritual leaders within themselves, known to be spiritual authorities, known to be the person you go to when you need to connect with the ancestors, when you need to heal, right? Second, I would say that is really primary to what we understood as, how we think of health and ill health, right? Is that for us, it was always a very we take a holistic approach to mental health and healing, right? So what we see now, for example, in the current times, psychology and mental health practices are quite isolated, right? We consider that the illness or the mental illness is in the individual and it's their responsibility, and they came into that illness of their own doing, for example, of their own inability to take care of themselves or to regulate themselves, right? Whereas before that, practices of healing for us were always communal and holistic, systemic, right?
And holistic. Yes. And on that point of, holistic and how you are comparing, how we used to, as Africans, how we used to perhaps go to traditional healers for healing, and how the approach was holistic, and the whole approach was different to what modern day psychology is, and how it diagnoses illnesses as separate islands, if I can say that. And it seems so segmented, and it seems like there's a title for everything. Like, you know what? My neighbor and I were talking the other day, and it was like there are so many illnesses that we don't even know. And this is now mental illnesses. There's this, there's that, there's this, there's that. Whereas before, if someone was ill, it wasn't a matter of categorizing the illness or, all these segments and all that. It was a matter of healing this person holistically, because it was that understanding that the problem can't be isolated. It's not this or that, but it's everywhere. And therefore, to heal a person properly, it's just to cover all these, areas. Hence, a holistic way of healing, again, pre-colonial times, and not what's happening right now with, the modern day psychology and the approach to psychology nowadays.
100%. I mean, before, now you go to the doctor and you go one man because it's your business, it's private, right? Before, it wouldn't be really acceptable or preferred, or it wouldn't be good practice to go to the healer by yourself, because even though you're the one who's ill, right, the understanding is that if you're ill, then something in your family system is not working, and the illness is just showing up in you, for example. And so when we talk about healing, right, when you go to the healer, you go as a family unit, because that whole system is affected, right? Of course, it's also like, if the problem is very extensive, there's like rituals that can be done as a community even, because if the family is ill, the community is ill, right? Or there's a part in the community that's ill. So we very much took a very systemic and a holistic approach that, we're not, here now, you could even feel guilty for falling ill, because somehow the responsibility is fully on you, right? There's no way, or there's no consideration of what's going on in your environment, what's going on in your relationship environment with your family and so on, what's going on in your community environment that needs healing, such that, it doesn't like show up in you as an isolated factor. Even healing methods would then look at, it's not just you who gets the healing treatment, it's you, it's your family, and if need be, a ritual is done for that community or that neighborhood. Whereas now, I mean, it's very also, like I said, very secretive. There's a shame factor in it, which for us, honestly, adds to, the illness, right? Because now you're also carrying the guilt of being categorized as having whichever mental illness for us. And even in the way that we categorize mental illnesses, it wasn't like necessarily that, we recognize in general depression, anxiety, psychosis, and things like that, but it was very much always connected to a spiritual element, right? So the reason why perhaps you're feeling low is because, I don't know, the ancestors are upset with you because you don't have a good relationship with your parents, and therefore a cleansing ritual needs to be done for you and your family to appease the ancestors, right? That speaks to a spiritual element, that speaks to recognizing that the illness is not the sole responsibility of the person who's showing up and saying, I have these problems, but also speaks to healing, family relationships, speaks to healing the individual, and speaks to healing the spiritual element that we inextricably attach to, I suppose, just being black. I don't know.
But like on that note, right, and especially on the note of the methods of dealing with mental illness, pre-colonial times of Africa, and modern day psychology, or the modern day approach to mental illness. I'm of the understanding that mental illness was, or has been, I think even today, you'll confirm that especially as Africans and as Black Africans especially, we think that mental illness is perhaps a bad spirit, and I'm of the idea that in the past, and especially the past generations, it was a taboo, and if someone had a mental illness in the family, they attributed quickly to maybe a curse, and they have to hide the person, and it's so much shame. And then we'll look at the Western approach to mental illness, and how they don't hide the person that is mentally ill, and there's an element of not being ashamed but embracing and loving the person. What would you say about that? Would you say that even today, Africans and the Black community, do they recognize mental illness for what it is, and are they interested in solving it, whether holistically or otherwise? But is there a difference in terms of the recognition of what mental illness is?
The answer to that is a little bit complex, right? Because I think part of the reason why there's such a big shame culture around mental illness in Black communities currently, right, has to do with how we've kind of, been positioned in the capitalist stage, right? And how we've kind of been conditioned to hide, to be made to feel like, let's say, for example, this is an example I use a lot, but the idea that, if you are a Black person who relaxes, for example, right, you'd be considered lazy. Does that make sense? And so
yes,
things that would slow a person down, some of the symptoms of depression, for example, are like lethargy and being tired, or lacking focus, or whatever else some of the symptoms might be, being low mood all of the time, right? In the current capitalist society, and maybe even traveling on from like apartheid times to here we are now, right? Being a Black person who's sad, low mood, can't get up and do their work and things like that, that's considered like shameful for just by virtue of being Black and being considered a source of labor in this kind of societal context. Whereas it's much more easily accepted if you are white per se, because it's not looked on, culturally, it's not a bad thing to be a white person who's relaxed. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Culturally, it's not a bad thing to be a white person who can be expressive about their moods, because there was never any social punishment for being emotionally expressive, right? If you were a Black person living in apartheid who was emotionally expressive, there was a lot of social consequences for that. Does that make sense? So
yes,
yeah, socially speaking, there's a lot of factors that kind of play into how it is that we as a Black community now think of mental health and some of the symptoms that go along with it. But I'd say, like, again, if we look back to pre-capitalist times, right, healing and healing practices were always communal, were always community-oriented, were always family-oriented, right? So they wouldn't have been the opportunity for that kind of shame of like, I'm ill, so there's shame around that. There would be shame around some family value-based things, right? About maybe dishonoring your parents, dishonoring your community, dishonoring whatever cultural values are upheld within that particular, say, culture or tribe or whatever else, but not around illness. Funny thing is, around illness, that's usually when people really come together, because they understand that even though it's you who's ill, it's something in the relational and community system around you that's showing up in you as an illness. And so when you go to, when you go to seek healing, the healer consults the family, because it's the family as a unit.
It's communal after all. Yes,
exactly.
So what I'm getting from you is the main difference, and I think it's a very, very significant difference with even a golden thread of capitalism, is that, mental, or the approach to mental illness pre-colonial times, now contingent to Africa, and post-colonial times again within Africa, is that, it was more community-based, and it was more of a holistic approach, not isolated, not systematic, but instead, involving the unit, whereas today, with the modern day or Western practices of, psychology, it's quite segmented, quite systematic, I would say secretive, and a bit more complex to what it used to be, in the African, landscape. But now,
and one thing I want to kind of emphasize also is that
please.
It was definitely a spiritual practice, which is a massive difference between now. I mean, right now in mental health practices, training as a psychologist, for example, you'll never hear anything about the spiritual element, except that maybe it's something that you might speak about, but you don't even get trained in how to manage some of the spiritual element that we, consider as quite literally an integral part of understanding healing and health. Whereas, in African practices, that was the heart and soul of understanding any kind of health or healing or illness.
Definitely. Yes. So now, lastly, I just want to, have an understanding of what you think about which of these African practices are still possible but are not practiced today.
So I suppose, a lot of the stuff are possible in the sense that, for example, a lot of types of treatments, right, that traditional healers would use in terms of, colonial times, or even now just not widely practiced, would be anything that has to do with physical movement. So one thing that a lot of people don't know, for example, is that dance and that kind of just getting lost in that spiritual trance dancing is critical to Black mental health, because we're very much a people of movement and rhythm and music and things like that. So that's and that speaks to, releasing trapped emotions and things like that get trapped in the body. So a lot of movement-based therapies are still possible, but not widely practiced when we think of mental health. Although recently I'm seeing a few of those come in with some of the up-and-coming psychologists or mental health workers coming around who also practice, say, yoga and things like that. They start to integrate yoga
But
practice.
it's very strange for me, it's very strange how, in terms of the Western practices of psychology, how again, now in the context of the golden thread that I made reference to about capitalism, it's like they've stripped our identity
100%.
in terms of our healing practices. And on that note of movement, I'm paying attention to some psychologists and psychiatrists and people that have studied the mind and all that, and the things that they are saying. For an example, they'll have instead of sitting in a boardroom and having a meeting, they'll have walking meetings, because they're talking about how movement and a certain rhythm makes you think a certain way. And it's just like, but this is what Africans used to do. It's not
been doing.
It was our lifestyle, but it's us. It's been us,
Look,
so that's what I found on that note of movement.
Yeah, I think for the longest time, right, a big part of the issue between, let's say, for example, I'm speaking quite broadly here, right, but when I speak about whiteness in terms of like, as a representative of white culture, let me say, versus blackness in terms of just broadly speaking about black culture, is that quite honestly, and this is no shade at all, but we've always been a very sophisticated people, culture, lineage of people. And what you'll see now is that with all the science that's kind of only catching up with us now, what we're realizing is that all the stuff that are now like the cool, healthy, this is the way to do it, we've been known, like it's in our ancestral lineage. That's what I'm saying. I think like dance and movement, things like we're seeing a lot of more pulling together of community lately. Where does that come from? I'm not saying that it's only black people that can pull together in terms of community healing stuff, right? But we've always been community oriented. We've always been spiritually oriented. We've always been aware of how energy works in our lives, right? Yeah. And now we're only really coming back to a realization of that. And yet we've been saying that throughout the years. But if you're in a white supremacist kind of culture that assumes that because you're black, you're not smart, or you don't know, or you can't be scientifically sophisticated because we don't research and move the same way they do. But really, what's their science showing them now? That we've been here. We've been new.
Imagine. Imagine. I mean, so I just sense that, again, mental health is one of the things that I could say cultural, I think it's a cultural expropriation. Because now taking elements of what they like about what we used to do, and then backing English and things that are written, whereas it was our lifestyle, it was who we are, movement-based people, holistic approaches to things, community-based approaches to mental illness. That's always, been us. And like you're saying, with what's happening now with the modern day psychology, it's just proving that I think Africa wins again. Unfortunately, not enough of us as Africans understand our power. But I'm so glad that you're highlighting that that's the shift that's also evident in the psychological space and the mental health space, that it's evident that Africa wins. And what I'm also getting is the practices, the healing practices that used to exist before the colonial times and our ancestral healing practices. There are definitely golden threads of that now, and more are emerging, which I think is a great thing, to go back to the basics.
100%. And Basadi is here to champion that movement all the way through.
Yes. That is why you're here. So,
Mm.
just in closing, do you have any closing, sentiments or insights about, the history of Black mental health? Because next week we're going to talk about, where we are now. But
Yeah.
now, in terms of the history of Black mental health, do you have any closing sentiments?
I think to say that just that I think we should trust our own knowledge and knowing. Often
Mm,
we look outside of ourselves as a people to find answers to the things that really, if we just look backwards to our ancestral connections, all the answers we need for how to maintain ourselves are there. And there's nothing that new that's coming up that we that our ancestors, our parents, grandparents, and before that didn't already know as just a cultural practice, as just a way of how we moved in the world.
mm,
We got kind of stripped of that, and I suppose we're coming back to a space of realizing that again and waking up to that again. And at least I'm
mm.
happy about that. Yeah.
Wow, I love that. So thank you so much for that. So we should trust ourselves, and I think if we go back to the basics, we will
Mm.
understand that nothing is new, and we should just rely on, our culture more often, and lean onto the understanding that our forefathers, our foremothers, were really the plug for all these things,
I'm
right?
saying 100%.
Yes, girl. Wow. Okay. Now, thank you so much for your time, Ms.
Thank
Boledi. Thank you so
you.
much for your insights. I hope that our listeners will resonate to some of the things that you've shared, some of the insights. I've learned so much, and we're looking forward to having you guys back again next week, same time, same place. So, thank you.
100%. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.